Lives of the Saints by the Reverend Alban Butler, taken from the 4th edition, published in 1954. January 2nd, St. Macarius of Alexandria, Incaret. St. Macarius the Younger, a citizen of Alexandria, followed the business of a confectioner. Desirous to serve God with his whole heart, he forsook the world in the flower of his age and spent upwards of 60 years in the deserts in the exercise of fervent penance and contemplation. He first retired into Thavaeus, or Upper Egypt, about the year 335. Having learned the maxims and being versed in the practice of the most perfect virtue under masters renowned for their sanctity, still aiming, if possible, at greater perfection, he quitted the Upper Egypt and came to the Lower before the year 373. In this part were 3 deserts, almost adjoining to each other, that of Sete, so called from a town of the same name on the border of Libya, that of Cells, contiguous to the former, this name being given to it on account of the multitude of hermit cells with which it abounded, and a third which reached to the western branch of the Nile, called from a great mountain the desert of Nitria. St. Macarius had a cell in each of these deserts. When he dwelt in that of Nitria, it was his custom to give advice to strangers, but his chief residence was in that of the cells. Each anchoret had here his separate cell, which he made his continued abode, except on Saturday and Sunday, when all assembled in one church to celebrate the divine mysteries and partake of the Holy Communion. If any one was absent, he was concluded to be sick, and was visited by the rest. When a stranger came to live among them, everyone offered him his cell, and was ready to build another for himself. Their cells were not within sight of each other. Their manual labor, which was that of making baskets or mats, did not interrupt the prayer of the heart. A profound silence reigned throughout the whole desert. Our saint received here the dignity of priesthood, and shone as a bright sun influencing this holy company, whilst St. Macarius the Elder lived no less eminent in the wilderness of Sete, 40 miles distant. Palladius has recorded a memorable instance of the great self-denial professed and observed by these holy hermits. A present was made of a newly gathered bunch of grapes to St. Macarius. The holy man carried it to a neighboring monk who was sick. He sent it to another. It passed in like manner to all the cells in the desert, and was brought back to Macarius, who was exceedingly joyful to perceive the abstinence of his brethren, but would not eat of the grapes himself. The austerities of all the inhabitants of that desert were extraordinary, but St. Macarius in his regard far surpasses the rest. For 7 years together he lived only on raw herbs and pulse, and for the 3 following years contented himself with 4 or 5 ounces of bread a day, and consumed only 1 little vessel of oil in a year, as Palladius assures us. His watchings were not less surprising, as the same author informs us. God had given him a body capable of bearing the greatest rigors, and his fervor was so intense that whatever spiritual exercise he heard of or saw practiced by others, he resolved to copy the same. The reputation of the monastery of Tabenna under St. Pachomius drew him to the place in disguise some time before the year 349. St. Pachomius told him that he seemed too far advanced in years to begin to accustom himself to their fastings and watchings, but at length admitted him, on condition he would observe all the rules and mortifications of the house. Lent approaching soon after, the monks were assiduous in preparations to pass that holy time in austerities, each according to his strength and fervor, some by fasting 1, others 2, 3, or 4 days without any kind of nourishment, some standing all day, others only sitting at their work. Macarius took some palm tree leaves steeped in water as materials for his work, and standing in a private corner, passed the whole time without eating, except a few green cabbage leaves on Sundays. His hands were employed in almost continual labor, and his heart conversed with God by prayer. If he left his station on any pressing occasion, he never stayed 1 moment longer than necessity required. Such a prodigy astonished the monks, who even remonstrated to the abbot at Easter against a singularity of this nature, which, if tolerated, might on several accounts be prejudicial to their community. St. Pachomius entreated God to know who the stranger was, and learning by revelation that he was the great Macarius, embraced him, thanked him for his edifying visit, and desired him to return to his desert, and there offer up his prayers for him. Our saint happened one day inadvertently to kill a gnat that was biting him in his cell. Reflecting that he had lost the opportunity of suffering that mortification, he hastened from his cell for the marshes of Sete, which abounded with great flies, whose stings pierced even wild boars. There he continued 6 months exposed to those ravaging insects, and to such a degree as his whole body, disfigured by them with sores and swellings, that when he returned he was only to be known by his voice. Some authors relate that he did this to overcome a temptation of the flesh. The virtue of this great saint was often exercised with temptations. One was a suggestion to quit his desert and to go to Rome to serve the sick in the hospitals, which by due reflection he discovered to be a secret artifice of vainglory, inciting him to attract the eyes and esteem of the world. True humility alone could discover the snare which lurked under the spacious gloss of holy charity. Finding this enemy extremely importunate, he threw himself on the ground in his cell and cried out to the fiends, "Drag me hence if you can by force, for I will not stir." Thus he lay till night, and by his vigorous resistance they were quite disarmed. As soon as he arose, they renewed the assault, and he, to stand firm against them, filled 2 great baskets with sand, and laying them on his shoulders, traveled along the wilderness. A person of his acquaintance meeting him asked him what he meant, and made an offer of easing him of this burden. But the saint made no reply, other than this, "I am tormenting my tormentor." He returned home in the evening, much fatigued in body, but freed from the temptation. Palladius informs us that St. Macarius, desiring to enjoy more perfectly the sweets of heavenly contemplation, at least for 5 days without interruption, immured himself within his cell for this purpose, and said to his soul, "Having taken up thy abode in heaven, where thou hast God and his holy angels to converse with, see that thou descend not thence. Regard not earthly things." The 2 first days his heart overflowed with divine delights, but on the 3rd he met with so violent a disturbance from the devil that he was obliged to stop short of his design, and return to his usual manner of life. Contemplative souls often desire, in times of heavenly consolation, never to be interrupted in the glorious employment of love and praise, but the functions of Martha, the frailty, and the necessities of the human frame, and the temptations of the devil force them, though reluctant, from their beloved object. Nay, God oftentimes withdraws himself, as the saint observed on his occasion, to make them sensible of their own weakness, and that this life is a state of trial. St. Macarius once saw in a vision devils closing the eyes of the monks to drowsiness, and tempting them by diverse methods to distractions during the time of public prayer. Some, as often as they approached, chased them away by a secret supernatural force, whilst others were in dalliance with their suggestions. The saint burst into sighs and tears, and when prayer was ended, admonished every one of his distractions, and of the snares of the enemy, with an earnest exhortation to employ in that sacred duty a more than ordinary watchfulness against his attacks. Palladius, who from 391 lived 3 years under our saint, was eyewitness to several miracles wrought by him. He relates that a certain priest, whose head, in a manner shocking to behold, was consumed by a cancerous sore, came to his cell, but was refused admittance. Nay, the saint at first would not even speak to him. Palladius, by earnest entreaties, strove to prevail upon him to give at least some answer to so great an object of compassion. Macarius, on the contrary, urged that he was unworthy, and that God, to punish him for a sin of the flesh he was addicted to, had afflicted him with this disorder. However, that upon his sincere repentance, and promise never more during his life to presume to celebrate the divine mysteries, he would intercede for his cure. The priest confessed his sin with a promise pursuant to the ancient canonical discipline, never after to perform any priestly function. The saint thereupon absolved him of the imposition of hands, and a few days after the priest came back perfectly healed, glorifying God and giving thanks to his servant. Palladius found himself tempted to sadness on a suggestion from the devil that he made no progress in virtue, and that it was no purpose for him to remain in the desert. He consulted his master, who made him persevere with fervor, never dwell on the temptation, and always answer instantly the fiend, "My love for Jesus Christ will not suffer me to quit my cell, where I am determined to abide, in order to please and serve him agreeably to his will." The 2 saints of the name of Macarius happened one day to cross the Nile together in a boat, when certain tribunes or principal officers, who were there with their numerous trains, could not help observing to each other that those men, from the cheerfulness of their aspect, must be exceeding happy in their poverty. Macarius of Alexandria, alluding to their name, which in Greek signifies happy, made this answer: "You have reason to call us happy, for this is our name. But if we are happy in despising the world, are you not miserable who live slaves to it?" These words, uttered with a tone of voice expressive of an interior conviction of their truth, had such an effect on the tribune who first spoke, that hastening home, he distributed his fortune among the poor, and embraced an eremitical life. In 375, both these saints were banished for the Catholic faith at the instigation of Lucius, the Arian patriarch of Alexandria. Our saint died in the year 394, as Tillemont shows from Palladius. The Latins commemorate him on the 22nd, the Greeks with the elder Macarius on the 19th of January. In the desert of Nitria there subsists at this day a monastery which bears the name of St. Macarius. The monastic rule, called St. Macarius's in the Code of Rules, is ascribed to this of Alexandria. St. Jerome seems to have copied some of things from it in his letter to Rusticus. The Concord, or collection of rules, gives us another under the names of 2 St. Macariuses. It was probably collected from their discipline or regulations and example. According to this latter, the monks fasted the whole year except on Sundays, and the time from Easter to Whitsunday. They observed the strictest poverty, and divided the day between manual labor and hours of prayer, Hospitality was much recommended in this rule, but for the sake of recollection, it was strictly forbid for any monk, except one who was deputed to entertain guests, ever to speak to any stranger without particular leave. The definition of a monk or anchoret given by the abbot Rancé of La Trappe is a lively portrait of the great Macarius in the desert. When, says he, a soul relishes God in solitude, she thinks no more of anything but heaven, and forgets the earth, which has nothing in it that can now please her. She burns with the fire of divine love, and sighs only after God, regarding death as her greatest advantage. Nevertheless, they will find themselves much mistaken, who, leaving the world, imagine they shall go to God by straight paths, by roads sown with lilies and roses, in which they will have no difficulties to conquer, but that the hand of God will turn aside whatever could raise any in their way, or disturb the tranquillity of their retreat. On the contrary, they must be persuaded that temptations will everywhere follow them, that there is neither state nor place in which they can be exempt, that the peace which God promises is procured amidst tribulations, as the rosebuds amidst thorns. God has not promised his servants that they shall not meet with trials, but that with a temptation he will give them grace to be able to bear it. Heaven is offered us on no other conditions. It is a kingdom of conquest, the prize of victory, but, O God, what a prize!